Hello and welcome everyone to our Vistatec Life Sciences in Focus podcast. Fascinating conversations with global life sciences experts. This is the space, as you know, where we interview life science experts once a month. And I'm your host, Karen Tkaczyk. So today we are talking regulatory affairs. And for that, we have a marvelous guest, Michelle Lott. Michelle is the founder and principal of Lean RAQA, a consulting company that serves over 100 companies, largely in the medical device area. Michelle has also served a 4-year term on the FDA's Device Good Manufacturing Practices Advisory Committee, and she guest lectures on regulatory affairs at institutions as diverse as the Atlantic Technological Institute of Galway and Johns Hopkins University, among others. So your bonus for today, listeners, is that you get a mix of accents from Scotland and Mississippi, an auditory extravaganza. And that's enough for me. Welcome, Michelle. Please let's start by telling the audience a little more about your background and your company.
Yeah. So I kind of had an interesting journey into the regulatory affairs space. I actually started my career as a forensic toxicologist at the Mississippi Crime Laboratory. And then I took what appeared to be a detour, and I went to manage my dad's Oriental rug business for a few years. And then I ended up moving to North Mississippi and got a job at Baxter Healthcare as the internal auditor at a facility that made medical devices, pharmaceuticals, and combination products. So they left a pile of regulations and international standards on my desk and said, know them, love them, your first audit's in a month, go. So, and then, you know, the rest is kind of history. I just, you know, kept having different opportunities open up based off of that foundation with the internal auditing. And they picked me for the internal auditor because I had social skills because of the retail background. And I had technical skills because of the laboratory. And they're like, well, most you know, quality and regulatory people, especially auditors, don't have that kind of social aspect. So that made me a good fit. And then that also kind of, you know, set me up for, you know, opening my own business and being able to effectively manage the clients and the projects.
How long is it since you opened up Lean RAQA?
Yeah, we're going on 12 to 13 years now. And Lean, I started it to serve, you know, kind of the small to mid-sized businesses as well as startups, and help them right-size the regulatory path, quality management system, and then make sure that their business strategy and their regulatory strategy, you know, kind of stayed in sync.
Excellent, because that can get really far out of sync, can't it?
It really can. Yeah. You know, we're treated as necessary evils, you know, a lot of the times. But if you're going to treat regulatory and quality as a necessary evil in the life science space, you're probably in the wrong industry, because that is not going to set your business plan up for success.
Indeed. So what do you find? You have a lot of clients over the years. What do you find surprises new clients most when you walk them through the regulatory pathway or QMS implementation, or if there is indeed any typical pattern or typical surprise?
Yeah. You know, I think especially with startups and small companies, especially where the inventor is also, you know, the CEO, they've done a lot of research already. They have, you know, been on the FDA website. They've been reading regulations and looking in databases, and they think, well, I understand this, even if they don't have a regulatory background. I've been told, well, hey, the regulations are written in English, and I, you know, read and speak English, so I understand what they're saying, but they're in their own dialect, you know, much like you and I have, you know, individually here. and people, I'm like, no, these are written in FDA speak. These are not written in, you know, kind of standard English, if you will. So
Absolutely.
they make a lot of mistakes because they think they know what it meant, but they don't know what it implies.
Okay. Right. So it's the years of experience of applying it and the conversations that you've had with the FDA, with all your various clients that, well, you can provide that advice, and that really, okay, so that's the biggest surprise for them. Fair enough.
Yep.
Very good.
So just like, you know, you guys, it's, you know, that translation between this language and what it means and what it implies, you know, in the larger context.
Yep. That's just why machine translation doesn't work, because the machine doesn't actually know the nuance of a lot of what's going on. It's good so far, but then you fall into traps, right? It's the same, it's exactly the same principle, right? You're needing that subject matter expertise piece. So that we are talking about RAQA in 2024. So I need to ask you about the European Union's medical device regulation. So talk to me about EU MDR. I know I've seen you write on this. I've seen you write that everyone's rolling the problem down the hill. Tell me about that.
Well, you know, similar to the translation issues with the FDA that we've seen, or we just talked about, it's the same in the EU, because you've got the commission. There's, you probably know better than I do how many different languages are represented. They'll draft something
24 usually, but yes, carry on.
So they draft it in English, then they translate it to 24 different languages. So that's, people are now, you've got 24 different, you've got it interpreted, like literally interpreted and translated. Then you've got people that are reading it in their native language, or even reading it in English. And so now we've got 3 or 4 layers growing of that interpretation. So the MDR from the start became like the game of telephone, you know? And then you've got the people who were originally, you know, were part of the authors aren't there anymore. And so there's nobody to go and check how this has been interpreted, not just literally translated, but, you know, how people are implementing it. And so that problem, as those translations and interpretations have rolled down hills from the commission, then you've got 40 some odd different notified bodies with in all different member states. And so now they're, you know, they're interpreting the translation, and they're the ones that are actually implementing it. And then that's leaving the manufacturer to kind of catch all of that. And it can vary depending on your notified body and what country there is in, and what is their kind of native or base language. So.
Yeah, people are really burnt out. What is that producing then on the manufacturer side? I've heard, for instance, that we're seeing significant movement to sunsetting, perhaps, products that it's not worth going through this for, and also starting with the FDA, starting with a US launch. Is that what you're seeing? More than my limited anecdotes.
I've been saying that not even Europe wants to go to Europe anymore. My outside of US business has significantly increased over the last few years, of people who don't want to tackle either just have already decided they just don't want to tackle it, or they're playing the wait and see game to see, you know, we're kind of T-minus just under 2 months now before we're gonna, you know, find out for real how many devices are not going to be available in Europe, because if you don't have a active contract by May 26th, then it's like having an expired driver's license. You know, you shouldn't be selling product in Europe anymore. So, but yeah, everybody's burned out. They either just don't want to, they can't afford it, and then they just don't know how everybody, I think, is still in shock and disbelief that this is really going to happen.
We've really got to this point and we still don't know, right? I mean, that's the feeling. And do you think the EU is going to make any significant changes? Do you have any insights into, I mean, from the high level, from the Commission level, are they thinking of changing anything, do you think, or are they still fumbling along?
I think they're still fumbling, and part of the reason is that they have told manufacturers, I mean, just like I think in the last month or so recently, if you think you're not going to continue to sell, notify us in advance. So then now they're trying to make it a requirement for manufacturers to tell them that they don't intend to pursue. Well,
to go through the process.
Do the math, European Commission. There was, last time I checked, there were about 17,000 outstanding certs, and only about 9,000 people had applied for the MDR.
Yeah.
So right there, you've got about half the devices that you can figure out they're probably not planning on transitioning.
Yep. So that sunsetting thing, all the old versions of things are being sunset. And
even the large companies, Karen, even like, the top largest medical device companies are cutting as much as 40% of their portfolio going into Europe because they're just really, consolidating to
niching down, consolidating. Yep, on the ones where they can truly make it happen. Are there still, are the notified bodies, let me put it this way, a year or two ago, the number of notified bodies qualified was too small, and the notified bodies were a very big bottleneck. Has that settled out now as we're into 24? Are more notified bodies available? Or is that still a bottleneck where the notified bodies are they have too much going on?
It's still a significant bottleneck. So while there are more in number, they are all competing for the same qualified resources. Okay. So there's not more people because now the qualification process is extremely strict underneath the MDR. And so it's like all the same people are floating between just because there are more notified bodies doesn't mean there's more resources available to audit, especially if you start stacking the very specific types of qualifications and MD codes and technology and etc. that people have to complete these reviews. And then it takes 12 to 18 months, depending on the complexity of the technology, to qualify a new resource and notified body. Yeah. So this is not a problem that's going to be solved. You're looking at something that is at least probably 2 years out, even if there were people available to hire that were qualified. Right.
It's still a significant issue. Yep. That's all that me as a sort of somewhat an outsider, but who sees little bits of what's going on, that matches my personal impression from the conversations we've been having. For those in the audience that don't know, in the new EU MDR, translation comes earlier in the process before products are approved, which is that shift drives business for companies like Vistatec, obviously, and also means we are aware of what's going on in that approval process. But it's good to talk to someone like Michelle, who sees it from more deeply, more intensely, with a larger number of clients. Yep. So what about changes in we've covered EU. What about FDA? Tell me about regulatory shifts there and what's going on at the FDA.
Yep. So there's a lot of interesting transitions that have been long awaited in the FDA that are finally coming to fruition. And the most important one is the QMSR, the Quality Management System regulation. So after, I think 1996 was the last time that there was a significant change to the quality system regulation. And that was when the FDA added design controls.
Yep.
1996 was also the first publication of the ISO 1345 standard that is kind of internationally recognized for the similar purpose of, kind of setting up and governing how quality management systems work. So
yes, with medical devices, yes.
Yes. So FDA has been sitting on the board that, or the technical committee that authors, ISO 1345 and even ISO 14971. So they've been working since 1996 to kind of bring not only the content of those two, closer together, but also the intent and the expectation of that FDA had behind the original QSR to be encapsulated in ISO 13485.
Very good.
And and that just went live February of this year, and then got a 2-year implementation date on that.
Right. One. QSR became QMSR. Yes. And there's always something to keep you busy, right? But that one doesn't, to my mind, seem to be as controversial. It seems everybody seems to be welcoming QMSR. Is that fair to say? You've just described why, right? The FDA's been involved and they're trying to shift towards a more harmonized, stronger system. And that's my impression, is that people are welcoming QMSR, that it is a step in the right direction. Is that fair?
Well, I think it depends. I think if the companies who already had an ISO 1345 certification and were already selling in the US, especially companies who held a medical device single audit program certification, are the most prepared, and there's it's just an alignment of a few definitions and perceptions. But if you were only selling in the US, you didn't have to have a certificate. The requirements of the QSR are more flexible in terms of how they implement them. The level of detail in which they need to contain and be implemented is also not as specific in the QSR itself. And all of those things get very, there are more procedures required. There's more content in those procedures required. There's more process monitoring. So there's just a lot if you're going from the QSR to the QMSR. And to me, I think you really have to read and understand the comments to the QMSR about FDA's expectations, because they say, okay, we're only codifying or making regulation the 1345 and the definitions of ISO 9000. So that too is make up the actual regulation. But then they say, if you want to know what we mean or expect out of this regulation, then you better know 14971. Then they say the same things about the notes. Well, if you want to know what we mean when we recognize a clause and it has a note, the note's not a regulation, but
yeah, you better read that note.
What we mean. And like so on and so forth, if there are dozens of standards that ISO 1345 mentions that are not part of the regulations, but the FDA has made clear they're part of their expectation.
So the reason I had a skewed, if you like, impression of that is that we are by definition working with companies that are operating globally in multiple languages. So that's why my impression is, I don't know those companies, that second set of companies that you mentioned as well. That's not where we're the people we're working with. The people we're working with are typically global in Europe and Asia, as well as North and South America, so they're already 1345. So that's why I had that impression that people are feeling pretty good about it. So yeah, good. Just shows you, we have exposure to a lot of the market in the business that we do, but not those smaller companies that haven't yet spread their wings beyond the US or US and Canada, for instance.
Right.
Very interesting. Yeah. So as we wind up here, is there anything else you'd like to share with our audience? Fun tidbit, serious matter, your call.
Yeah. Well, I just think the compliance difference between the EU and the FDA is so nuanced, because the FDA does a fairly good job at putting out guidance documents so that you understand their current thinking. And so I think it's both helpful and a burden at the same time, because there's so much more to take in when you're bringing a product to market at the FDA. So, I just really encourage people to, dig in, figure out what guidance documents apply to their products or apply to thinking for things like maybe on a broader, like software as a medical device. There's probably just a half. And you really do need a regulatory partner to help navigate the finer details of all this, but you still have an obligation to be aware that these things are out there. So that's it, really.
Yep, absolutely. Those guidance documents, feels like there's a new one every week, every few days. I read the ones that are I keep an eye on those guidance documents as a subject matter expert, and read the ones that refer to translation or refer to things that are important to our clients. And you're right, they're great, but sometimes they're 40 pages long, for goodness sake, right? So you
and the FDA publishes between 50 and 60 a year. So they average more than one a week, It's a lot.
So it is a lot to keep up with. And yes, you need regulatory experts to do that. Well, this has been a real pleasure, Michelle. Thank you for coming and talking to us, with me. It's been a delight. And to our audience, this Life Sciences in Focus podcast is available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, number of others, all the leading platforms, as well as on YouTube, if you prefer to watch us. Please make sure to tune in again next month for Vistatec Life Sciences in Focus, fascinating conversations with global life sciences experts.